Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Oh, this feels really formal. Welcome to my TED Talk. So my name is Aslan Bulbulia, one of the facilitators for today. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to this very popular session on securing local arts and culture spaces. We've got a wonderful panel lined up for you today, and I'm Johal, who will be moderating. Just to give you a general sense of how the session's going to go, we're here until 3:30. We'll begin with the panel remarks, followed by some digestion from the audience. So we'll give you like a little activity to work on while you digest your lovely Tebet lunch at the same time. And then we'll get some feedback from you based on what those questions that we gave you to digest are. And as we mentioned before, those will be the questions and answers that will help to shape some of the directions for the creative city strategy going forward. I think it's just, as mentioned again, if there's anything you see on the graphic facilitation that you think actually that's not the most accurate representation of what was said, please feel free to have a conversation about that, and we'll make sure that that's as accurate as possible. And we do have ASL interpretation, so if that's needed, we can make sure that the right people are in the right places for that. And without any further ado, I would love to hand over to Mr. Johal.
Good afternoon, everyone. Delighted that you could join us. And I think it's really important when we talk about the affordability crisis of the city, both in terms of how it affects art spaces, but also individual people, that we also grounded in some of the conversations from this morning, being on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh peoples. It's really pervasive, this question of the crisis of affordability. I myself have been rent-evicted. I've sat on the boards of organizations which have been affected and displaced. I know a poet from the city named Donato Mancini who wrote a poem around 2010 about all of the lost spaces in the city, and if we were to look back since 2010, you would probably have to write another 2 or 3 poems based on the types of spaces, small and large, that have had to move on from the city. And so I think it's really important we just jump right into this conversation. We have a delightful panel of guests that are going to be sharing some words with us. We'll go out to you for questions before the breakout. First, Diane Blunt is an artist of mixed descent. She's Ojibwe Métis on her father's side and German on her mother's. She's a member of the Kawartha Anishinaabe Nation. She's worked as a consultant with Urban Ink Theatre, Full Circle, and the City of Vancouver's Drum is Calling Festival, and has been developing the possibility of an Indigenous arts space. And next to her is Stephanie Allen. She's director of the Hogan's Alley Society, a director of the Hogan's Alley Society, formerly vice president at Catalyst Community Development Society. She's worked at BC Housing in the private sector and has realized projects on the ground. Moyang leads Community Art Stabilization Trust, a new nonprofit social enterprise focused on creating long-term, permanent, affordable workspace for the arts in San Francisco, Oakland, and other cities. It was launched in 2013, so it's wonderful to have Moy with us to give us a perspective from San Francisco. Next to her is Brian McBay. He's a cultural worker based in Vancouver, and in 2005, he co-founded 221A Gallery, which I have the good fortune to be on the board of and can only say good things because it's my role. So we're going to go right into it, so please join me in welcoming Diane Blunt.
Hi, I'm Diane Blunt, and hello. Check 1, 2. Hi, so I'm here today to share with you where we are around the idea of an Indigenous Performing Arts Center here in Vancouver. It's a place that doesn't exist yet, but there's many voices that feel it should. So we don't know what this space should be yet. So it's very, very early days. I should say I'm working as a project manager with Urban Ink, who are leading the feasibility study around this research. We are conducting one-on-one interviews with artists from the local nations, professional actors, performers from across the country, to see what their needs are, their desires are, what their vision is around such a place. These conversations have been happening for a long time now. There's been a need to have a place where Indigenous artists at a professional level can do their work. And in our conversations, it's being called home. It's being called a place, a destination where they can go and they can create and teach and share. So it's we're talking about all disciplines. We're talking about acting. We're talking about theater, music. Yes, some visual arts. When we talk about the idea, people just light up and the ideas just go on. And we'll have carving, and we'll have this, and there'll be canoes. And, so we're really dreaming big. In doing this work, we haven't identified where this place might be. We are getting the sense that it should be in Vancouver. So much work needs to be done with the local nations, the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh, and we have begun initial conversations with some of their artists. They will be key, the nations will be key to inform how this process will move forward in the future. So in that way, this is a really new and exciting initiative. It's really has to be born from a place of reclamation and reconciliation. It's not seemingly so far fitting some kind of template of this is your bonus amenity space and this is how you're gonna, fill the shell and outfit the shell. It's really got to start from ground up, from that place. And it's also exciting because it's coming from artistic voices. And another thing that I keep hearing over and over again is that art saves lives, that this type of place will echo in future generations. A barrier that we have is it's also quite clear that there's not just one organization that can lead this. The local, like Urban Inc. or Full Circle, for example, they have the capacity to kick along the idea, to take it step by step, but it's not just one organization leading the charge from beginning to end. So again, it's many collective voices. So we don't really have a full picture yet of how or what the model might be of such a space. Many artists, they want a space, but they don't want to run the space. So, I guess that's where we're at. Again, it's really, really early days where we are. We're nowhere near a business plan yet, or where like cost analysis of locations. So therefore, it's still really big dreams and really exciting, and I think really important dreams. It's about collecting voices from all over Canada. There's also been the idea of a trail, right? That artists, can go from Ottawa to Winnipeg to Calgary to Vancouver and share their work and their stories and their legends, and have a place to do so that aren't within the per se colonial models. So I think I'll start off from there. Thank you.
Stephanie.
Good morning, a good Monday afternoon, everyone. Just a real pleasure to be here, and I acknowledge that the work that I do is on unceded territory of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh people. Myself, a descendant of enslaved people on this hemisphere, stand in strong solidarity with Indigenous peoples, us stolen people on stolen land, so I do acknowledge that in my work and organizing. Great to be here to talk to you a little bit about the Hogan's Alley Society. My background is I'm probably the least creative person you will meet today. I don't work in the culture and arts myself personally. My background is in real estate development, most recently spending time in affordable housing creation and affordable spaces. I'm a Black Canadian, so my life has been immersed in culture in my home and how important that has been to my family and to that of my relatives. So that situates me in this conversation a little bit today. Hogan's Alley Society, for those of you that don't know, has been working with the City of Vancouver and all levels of government to pursue a community land trust on the former site of the Black community in Vancouver. The Black community in Vancouver once had a kind of a central heart in Strathcona, where the Georgia and Dunsmuir viaducts currently sit. And through systemic destruction of urban renewal, that community was displaced over decades of not only just the freeway system that went in, but it was actually decades of neglect. And what was lost when Hogan's Alley was lost was important community assets. There was a church that was owned by the community that at one time had hundreds of names of families that met there. There were private owned businesses and restaurants where culture was not only created but consumed by the broader Vancouver community. And so when the Black community of Vancouver was lost, we lost significant cultural assets and contributions to this city. Hogan's Alley Society is working to restore and regenerate. We know that the generation of folks that once lived there are actually, most of them are gone, but what we know persists is that anti-Black racism within our country and within our city continues to deprive Black Canadians from really contributing their best to our city and to our communities. And that includes our culture. We know that Black culture is in high demand. It's very consumed at the national and international level by music artists and many famous visual artists. But unfortunately, there's a lot of other versions of Black arts and culture that happens at the grassroots and local level. And when we don't have access and we don't have representation in spaces, these things cause negative impacts on this community having a chance to contribute. So Hogan's Alley Society has put forward a proposal for a community land trust that would exist on these lands, specifically the east block of Main Street where the on-ramp to the Georgia and Dunsmuir viaduct currently sits. And an important part of that proposal is an African Canadian cultural center. We've been working quite diligently to not only establish that this is a need in our community on a broader perspective, but to continue to work with the city so that the policies, the programs, the funding, and even the language around these initiatives that we're trying to pursue can actually acknowledge and address our community. We're not represented. Black Canadians in this city struggle both hypervisibility when we go into certain places. We are seen and we stand out, but we also suffer hyper-invisibility because we're not seen in boards, we're not represented in the power structures, we're not sitting in a lot of decision-making seats. So when we talk about our culture and the need for creative spaces, sometimes folks look at us and aren't quite clear of what that means or why. So our work has been, and a fellow director of mine is here, Vanessa Richards, who many of you probably know, but our work has been really educating people about what this is and why. So I've heard some other folks talking about today the work that we do, not only to pursue creative spaces from the position of marginalized communities, but we also are educating and continuing to explain why this really matters. One thing I know from my day job, as Am has mentioned, affordable, accessible spaces for the pursuit of the creative arts is dwindling in our city significantly. They're very vulnerable to not only redevelopment, but when places are redeveloped and new spaces are created, the costs are exorbitant. They're out of reach for many of the creative people in our communities, especially people who are marginalized. So I think there's opportunities as the creative strategy gets looked at about how, when all these other policies in city building and development and rezoning are being discussed, we can infuse creative components to it and cultural components of it. This talk is really about assets and an asset-based mentality and ideology. I think it's important that we understand that when groups are dependent on grants, they are vulnerable to those grants being taken away or changing when government attitudes change, political attitudes change. What's important is that assets actually create revenue. Assets generate revenue over time. The debts are paid off just like with any other mortgage, and those assets become increasingly affordable. When communities can hold those assets, when creative institutions can hold those assets, especially not-for-profit ones, they regenerate and allow for reinvestment in community, and they also preserve those spaces in the long term. So many of the places that we love are in jeopardy or have been lost already. And I think from that perspective, we really have to consider how these assets can stay in community hands. Now, one of the other things I looked at getting ready for this chat today was the 2017 report about community amenity contributions. Many of you know that when large developments go up in the city, developers negotiate what they call a community amenity contribution. And those funds go into the city, and the city then can use them to provide the much needed infrastructure that we need. Affordable housing obviously being at the top of that list, but cultural spaces, I noticed in that report, were only accounted for 2 out of the 58 negotiations that happened in 2017. I'm not saying that all the other priorities aren't important, but when we know that only 2 spaces or 2 potential spaces came out of 58, we start to understand the pressure that community groups are facing and that culture creators are facing when they're looking for affordable spaces. So I would suggest, as we think about what's possible today and how we can inform this strategy, to really ask questions around equity. There is an expression I have repeated in other places, and it says, institutions are either upholding white supremacy or dismantling it. There is no neutral ground. It's very important that as we move through this policy and we think about instituting things, how are we making sure that the colonial structures that have kept many communities out, not only of the decision-making spaces, but also in access, start to evolve and change and really be intentional about it? I think any strategy in this city, regardless of what it is, has to be very intentional, especially where it respects visible minorities and people that have been excluded for various reasons. I would also recommend, as we think about this, to reject some of the creative class rhetoric that has come out in recent years. A lot of that has been targeted at very established and affluent and privileged classes of people. It doesn't mean that we don't want to have inclusion for all people, but prioritizing the same will continue to perpetuate this inequality we keep seeing on the ground. I would also say to give credit to the people that are bringing forward these ideas. A lot of times when we sit in decision-making seats, or those of us with a little bit more power, we may hear ideas from people within the grassroots, and those ideas were neither compensated or acknowledged. I think it's really important that as we do this work, we kind of stop doing that. We make sure that we acknowledge the disability activists, the LGBTQ activists, the racialized people activists, Indigenous people activists, who have done all of the work that is starting to be reflected in our discourses at higher levels, but perhaps they weren't recognized and their work wasn't quite seen. And then I think to think about policy and assets in a way that this is a chance for groups to be self-determined. Self-determination is the desire of all people. Whether you're an individual or you're a member of an organization, you want to chart your path forward. You want to set your vision and go after your dream. And the way to help communities do that is not to necessarily put many roadblocks in place so that becomes an institution's version of that dream or a watered down version of that dream, but to really make sure that folks have the chance to self-determine. Hogan's Alley Society and the work that we've been doing has been really relying on that principle, that the Black community wants to participate in Canadian culture, in Vancouver culture, and contribute, but we want to do it on our terms. We want to do it in the way that we think will best lift our community and share ourselves in an authentic way. So I would say that's kind of wrapping up what I wanted to talk about. I would encourage you to support land trusts and support the kinds of things you're seeing come from the grassroots.
Thank you, Stephanie. Moy?
Hi, I'm Moy Ng. Can you hear me? Yes. Excellent. I'm going to stand up because I'm going to go to a visual, and I promise I won't read the slides. Could I ask the tech folks in the back, could you turn up the lights in the house a little bit? Because I have a quick question before I start talking at you. How many people in the room are artists? Excellent. How many people in the room are cultural workers or administrators? Cool. I didn't say it was one or the other. I just said this is not an SAT. Thirdly, how many people in the room are urban planners? Way cool. How many people are real estate developers in the room? I know you're a real estate developer. Okay, excellent. Have I forgotten anybody? Any sector? Okay, cool. I just always like to try to direct my remarks, or at least the conversation that I hope we'll have, that'll be facilitated, to who's in the audience, so we're not just speaking in a vacuum. So I'm with Community Art Stabilization Trust, and we are an oxymoron. Ready? There'll be a quiz on this afterwards. We are a startup, nonprofit, real estate development and holding company for arts and culture in one of the 3 most expensive places to live and work in the United States, and one of the top 15 in the world. What a dubious honor. We are the little caboose that could. Can I have the next slide, please? So, the problem, you're all living with it. So, in a nutshell for San Francisco, because we're San Francisco, Oakland based, is we are looking at artists and arts organizations displaced. We've stopped counting. I mean, it is really, you've already heard the beginning of the conversation, hundreds. And the cost of living and working in San Francisco is it's either prohibitively expensive or expensive. Right now, it's prohibitively expensive. Thirdly, the average cost for rent now is going up every year by over 30% a year. So you can do the numbers, that's not an algorithm. And lastly, in terms of the cost per square foot, we've, based on our findings on 3 different studies by the San Francisco Arts Commission, a local housing corporation in San Francisco, the City of Oakland, and our own, we're looking at the cost of what artists can afford short of pro bono and zero is somewhere around $150 to $225. Of course, cheaper is always better. And that said, the cost per square foot in San Francisco and Oakland right now, are you ready? What was the figure I just shared with you? 150 to, excellent. You're gonna pass, you're gonna ace this quiz. It's $5 to $7.50 a square foot, and I'm not talking about the Class A buildings. So you start adding that up, if you need 1,000 square feet, or 2,000 square feet, or 5,000, or 10, it gives you a little pause. All right, let's, next slide, please. Next slide, please. So what do? So what does Caste do? You heard we're an oxymoron. We focus on the long game. We're a nonprofit focused specifically with arts and culture. Artists and arts organizations, small and mid-sizers, are at the center of our work. And what we do is focus on the long game, which is creating, developing, buying spaces workspaces, buildings, permanently. So we have permanent assets. So let's go to the next slide. So how do we do this? We stabilize the rent once we acquire, below market. 2, we use innovative financing that isn't normally used or aggregated within arts and culture sector. Thirdly, we work on capacity building through re-grants and technical assistance, both individualized to group that's with a real estate lens to build capacity so that folks can make, and organizations can make smart, thoughtful, let me echo self-determination, can make smart and thoughtful decisions about creating, developing, leasing their space. What we also do is when we purchase a space, we lock it in with a deed restriction. So it can only be used for arts and culture usage. So not only is it for the organization that ultimately it's going to be the home for and house, but also that even if it changes hands, it must remain an arts and culture asset. And last but not least, we also do some things that are really, because the issue around affordable or rather inaffordable space is time sensitive and urgent. How many times have we either been evicted or heard friends were evicted or colleagues were evicted? Oh my God, I'm in a month-to-month lease. What am I going to do? And I've got this landlord that's blowing down my neck who's not friendly. And your work is hyper-local and in your community, so what do you do? So, there are several things. One, I mentioned earlier about the technical assistance and re-grant initiatives. We also have just launched a dynamic map that provides 450 cultural facilities, but city-owned and not-for-profit, to begin to place and make visible all of us, the work we do in community, so that it attracts not only visibility, but also hopefully increased investment from all of the folks and the sectors that we're working with. Next slide, please. So what have we done? The little caboose that could. We were just an idea, and I mean just an idea, 7 years ago. We became a nonprofit because our founding board members thought that this was going to be a long-running problem and it wasn't just going to be 2 model projects. So in the last 5 years, we've raised $38.5 million. We've purchased and acquired 4 buildings totaling 32,000 square feet in one of the most expensive cities in the US. And our first 2 organizations, our first 2 arts partners, contemporary performing and visual arts organizations embedded in their neighborhoods and their communities, are now serving approximately 95,000 people a year. And another way of thinking about it, it's 1 out of every 8 San Franciscans in the city. Next slide, please. I know, it's cool. I should also just say that, and I'm sort of probably jumping this, is Vancouver, San Francisco, Denver, Shanghai, London, Miami, Chicago, New York, Auckland, Sydney, Tokyo. We are all sharing the issue of a place that's beautiful to live and work, that artists are embedded in their communities, and culture bearers, knowledge keepers, and yet we find ourselves threatened in terms of space. So other than money and additional resources and leadership, we do need physical space. So all of these cities have reached out, believe it or not, to Caste to say, what are you doing so we can learn? So we are beginning to see an informal and a more formalized network of sharing of best practices, failures, because yes, things go wrong, and successes, so that it begins to build this work globally. London, actually, the City of London has modeled their creative land trust on Caste, which is sort of cool, and they just launched it earlier this last month. So you heard about the map, and if I share this, I can be happy if anybody's interested to share with you the map so you can take a look at some of the work or any of the things that we're doing. Over the next several years, we're going to try to acquire, we're actually in negotiation, an additional 100,000 square feet. Next slide, please. our awesome team. 5 out of 6 are artists, either currently practicing or formerly practicing across film, theater, music, dance. Next. So that's what it's going to cost to preserve another 100,000 square feet plus $95 million, of which I'm currently negotiating at this moment, cross your fingers everyone and light a candle, about $20 million of that 95 million. Got to move on it. I hope that happens. Anyway, that said, next slide. Next slide. What it takes is a community. Because effectively all of us, and I'm just going to echo and say what Diane said, what Stephanie said, and definitely what Brian will say, is that all of us, in our own ways, are building community. In terms of space, I feel like our work is really about creating physical space to allow the heart and soul, the creative soul of our communities, to make room for possibility, for transformation, for beauty, for provocation, for curiosity. That's the work that we're all doing. And for Caste, it's really about creating the physical space in San Francisco and Oakland and other cities. So thank you so much for inviting us to share this and to learn from all of you.
Thank you, Mary. Brian?
Thanks. I always feel I get put last to so they can cut me, or so that I can ask. Maybe I can ask a hard question.
We're running out of time, Brian.
But we were supposed to be in the basement, and because this is a space-related discussion, I wanted to say we've already achieved quite a bit by moving out of the basement. So I'll just speak briefly about the history of an organization I work with, and try to ask a couple questions. 221A was started by a group of students, sort of a generation of people who sort of came of age in the 90s, which was a period that was after socialism had been destroyed. And so we were told that no longer the kind of crisis of capitalism and socialism was something to deal with, but rather it was just Coke versus Pepsi, and we had to accept the kind of cynical market realism of real estate. And I bring it up kind of because I think this audience I can be a little more kind of open with, but really sort of thinking about private property was something that 221A has been involved with for many years. And something that, a paradigm that we have to consider, I think, when we talk about colonialism. And 221A really came about as a result of, we're kind of like a weird vegetable that grew out of this ground, right? Which is, you know, a stagnant public sector support, a kind of neoliberal approach to funding, and a lack of space, an economic crisis. So me being from Chinatown, this group of students, we first started in Chinatown and learned very quickly that Chinatown's a really fascinating place because there's groups of family clan associations that own their own property and have sort of worked with the private property paradigm and held on to real estate in a really interesting way that now, actually today, I'm kind of sitting here as a result of it. And I think in particular, the kind of embattled neighborhood of Chinatown represents this kind of global dynamic that we're talking about. Having to sort of grapple with ambiguous and exclusionary structures that I think we've brought up, often sort of seen within merit-based kind of processes. And so coming from the art world perspective, which I'll speak a little bit about, and the grant kind of funding side, there's often a focus on excellence. And I'll just let everyone know I'm also on the advisory committee for the Creative City Strategy. So a lot of what has drawn me to continue to be involved in this voluntary committee is that the planners have shown great interest in dispelling us of the word excellence. And so just to say quickly that my experience with most of the art world is that excellence has been this exclusionary sort of opaque structure that we've had to work through. And the reason to bring it up is because I think it's really critical at this time not to just think about space as a square footage problem, a resource problem, a kind of we need cheaper space in the future problem, but also think of it as the art world ready to be mature enough to think about equity? And so it's kind of a very tough realization that's also really simple. And so 221A, we, just to kind of give a bit of my CV almost, we did we moved into Chinatown in 2008. In 2011, we moved into another building. In 2013, we moved into another building. And in 2015, we opened a public art site. And in 2015, we also opened another building. And then we started to sort of move beyond, I guess, what you call survival. And now we're in a position where we have sort of the ability to negotiate at the table. And so when we're doing that, I think a key focus for us is imagining how to rethink not only these kind of resource problems, but thinking through how the future will work. And so the question I'll ask is, can a land trust model, which this is the second time I've met Moy, aside from hanging out on the weekend, but will a land trust offer us both a cheaper future, but also create a more equitable one for the cultural sector? So thank you.
I want to start with one question to each of you, and we'll go out to the audience to take 2 or 3 questions in a row and get the panel to respond before the breakouts. But if you had 1 or 2 ideas to throw out there for the City of Vancouver to consider in terms of putting into the plan, what would it be? Any of you can jump in.
I can start. I think the mapping tool is a phenomenal idea. I think what we have in this city, not only do we have a shortage of spaces, but there are some hidden spaces that do exist that can be programmed and used by creative individuals and organizations. I think about the church sector that I work with and have worked with in real estate development. There's a lot of places that are only busy on Sunday afternoons or Sunday mornings. So there's a lot of surplus spaces that do exist. And are there opportunities for groups to, when the city is doing these redevelopment plans for such spaces, to be very keenly aware of how community groups are currently accessing those spaces, and then ensuring that any redevelopment plan is inclusive of other groups that are currently there, but maybe they're as tenants, so don't have the same decision-making power in that asset. So I think that's something I've seen in my work as an idea as well.
I was going to say, I get really excited about hearing the work that Moy is doing. I think that empowering some more support services, like kind of around the work, like what BC Artscape is doing, and even what Brian is doing, this work around land trusts, sharing those resources, because often it seems the onus is put on the smaller groups to do the work that they don't know how to do. Per se, and with the Indigenous community, often there's still like a mistrust there still, and maybe not knowing on how to access any kind of monies or what's available, or even a desire to go there. So to have different approaches to enable different ways of thinking around, how a building might get built is really exciting. So,
one thing I had forgotten, and maybe it's something for the city to think about, or with the intermediaries that are in the room. One of the things very specifically as a strand that Caste does is we will work with a small and mid-sized arts organization and say, we're going to work with Diane. And Diane's approached Caste, and they want their own home. And they've gone through a lot of the early, even later conversations about how much space, What do we want this building to be? Do we have the financial capacity, we'll work with you on this, to actually buy our own home and then sustain it with the program so that, again, and I'm quoting one of my founding board members, that the building is wrapped around the programming, not the other way around. And so what we'll do is we'll work with Diane, and Diane will say, I think we're ready, and I say, yes, let's go. You'll have some equity, so you'll bring a bit of a down payment. Caste will bring some money into the deal, financing and philanthropic dollars. We will purchase the building together. And then, given the financing structure, we could freeze the price, give you a below market rate lease for 7 to 10 years, and we'll use 7. So in year 7, what we've done is freeze the price. You have 7 years not only to operate and be in your neighborhood or be in your new neighborhood, do programming, as well as learn how to have your own home in a way that's very individualized with us, as well as have 7 years to raise the money to buy your home at the price we financed. So that's actually what we're doing with our first 2 projects. So.
I'm already on the panel advisory committee, so I feel like I've already said a lot to these guys, but I would just say the city and the federal government should gang up on the province and bully them. That would be my... Yeah. Oh, so yeah, bully is not a good word anymore. But yeah, that's...
All right, we have time for 3 questions in a row from the audience. I think that there is a microphone right here. If you could just raise your hand. I think there's one right there, Jesse, and another one right there. Go ahead. We'll wait till we take the 3 questions before the panel will respond, but go ahead, Terry.
Hi, thank you very much. Is this on?
Yeah.
Very interesting and informative conversation. One of the things that's come up for me in this conversation, I live in the downtown east side, often called the poorest neighborhood in Canada. And I've had the blessing to live there and work there for over 40 years. Now the community is going through massive gentrification. And so when we talk about artist spaces, which I support, obviously I'm an artist and a producer, but I'm also thinking about the residents of my community. And how can they be protected within... How's that?
I think mine is working.
Yeah, the light.
So I live in the downtown east side. I've had the blessing to live there for 40 years. And it's been my home and the place where my work has happened over the last 40 years. And I'm very aware that the community has gone through gentrification. It's another form of what we in the community call colonization happening within our neighborhood. And I'm very concerned and very worried about the residents of our neighborhood. So when we start talking about spaces for artists, which I strongly support, I also am very concerned that the residents of the neighborhood are not displaced from the community. So how do we talk about artist spaces, and how do we talk about the residents of that community who have the right to remain in their community and not be displaced?
Great. Thank you, Terry. Go ahead, Jesse.
Yeah, I had a question for Moy coming from San Francisco, because I think we can see the next decade, the next couple decades, where cities are developing on the ground but in the cloud at the same time, and how neighborhoods will be master planned with kind of digital infrastructures behind them. And so as we're thinking about how to make space equitably, how do we do so in the future that preserves people's digital rights? Because I find a lot of the time there's going to be pressure from kind of technologists and planners who are planning for technology in the city in revolutionary ways that doesn't quite hit the real ethics of what's on the ground and what the organizations they're working with really want to hold close.
Thank you. We've got time for one more question or comment if there's one out there.
One here. Does this work now?
Oh, there's one right there.
Is this working?
Yep.
I think you have to kind of talk really close into it.
I work out of a park in Strathcona, and we have 2 shipping containers. So this is a park board initiative where we recognize the need. If we were going to have artists in the parks, we needed infrastructure. And we were told at the planning table there was no money for building. But when I mentioned shipping containers, everybody's eyes lit up, and it was not something they'd ever thought of as actually functional studio space beforehand. They've only ever put shipping containers after the fact. So we have these 2 shipping containers that have electricity, they have floor heating, we have cold water taps outside, and it is such a fantastic model for being able to have an easy, simple space to be able to just open a door, it's secure when I lock it at the end of the day, to engage people in city parks. And I would love to see some model like that that is really simple. Like the big projects are fantastic, but I think really simple, easy, accessible opportunities where there could be, a shipping container community village in a local park where multiple artists have these shipping containers as studio spaces. I think options like that should be considered and put forward as the city goes forward of how to keep things affordable.
Great, thank you. Wondering if anyone on the panel can respond to any of those questions and comments.
I can talk about displacement. I think it's a resonating issue with the Black community. Black communities in Canada have been displaced across this country for 150 years or more, plus Hogan's Alley was displaced. And our proposal for that block included that the city not sell any of that residential space as condominiums. We made that intervention, that disruption, if you will, to the process. I don't think it was at first received well, but what we did have was broad community support, because we realized that if we were gonna sell condominiums at $2,500 a square foot above an African Canadian cultural center, we would not have a fulsome community that would be there patronizing and as a part of that community. So our proposal was that 100% of the residential space actually be rental, and that at least 70% of it be below market. So that actually, not only is it rental space now, that's where people live, nobody speculates as a renter, and with the majority of it being below market, you're shifting the power balance from those of us who may be able to pay more and bring in services that can pay, to actually those that actually can't, can't afford to pay as much in the market, and therefore the land values in that area aren't going to be triggered by market housing and market real estate development, right? So that was a really important way to think about the whole community. And I think as we look at these assets and where these assets go, you're right. They can be a catalyst for gentrification. They can, send property values up. So to be very considerate about how the entire community is being developed, and I think also nonprofit ownership also devalues land right away. It's taken out of speculation. So I think those are critical components to keep involved in the conversation so that displacement does not happen.
To the person who articulated the second question, could you re-articulate, because it sounded like more of a statement and a context, so I understand the core piece of what you would like us to answer, not just Caste.
Hello.
Just a question around how have you dealt with pressure from kind of tech companies influencing the way communities are defined in San Francisco?
That's a great question. I'll just say to you that Caste was and is privileged. We were invited to the table by all the key sectors except for the high-tech companies. It's a fact. I'm just giving you our origin story. So, urban planners, public and private sector leadership, philanthropic leadership, artists, arts organizations, the 2 arts municipal agencies, the Department of Planning, the Department of Real Estate, City Hall. So there was a host there were a lot of people that invited Caste to the table and see us as a solution. And notice I didn't use the word the solution in caps, because we're just part of a constellation of individuals and leadership and people who care about this issue, and it's complex. So that's the direct answer is we're not dealing with the tech companies. Who we are dealing with is being both strategic and opportunistic in purchasing property. So here's just a quick sampler of what we're willing to do. We're one of those folks that, because we were born out of, we're so new, we're almost like a living laboratory of trying out things built on best practices from affordable housing, community development, and arts and culture, and coalescing them in a way that brings together a variety of resources and leadership and financial mechanisms to bear to the entire arts sector, period, in a way to keep artists and creatives and hybrids and collectives. We're really agnostic about that, because we need space. So I know that's a long-winded sort of contextualized thing. It's not that we're unwilling to work or, with the high-tech industry writ large or leaders. It's we haven't been brought to the table. We haven't, at this point, we've moved on our initial projects in this way. One of our key, in addition to the public sector, what we've done is also work with a real estate developer who brought us to the table and I think you call it something different here, but in San Francisco it's called a community benefits package, where they're giving us a building plus a multi-million-dollar grant towards redeveloping a building. Yeah, I know, it was a good, but we still have to do the work, right? But we get the main charge of turning that building into a public community and cultural asset, and that is a community arts center. And we actually have that opportunity with the next 3 projects. Is that helpful? Did I answer your question? Mostly. Well, I answered the first piece of it. I don't think I can add any more to it at this point.
Yeah.
Cool.
Go ahead.
I guess I'd just like to add that the type of work that we're talking about is, we always hear the word professional, because in our conversations around the Indigenous Performing Arts Center, it quickly becomes everything to everybody. It becomes about housing, it becomes about education, and it becomes easily all these other things. And I think we just have to really take our time and work step by step and acknowledge that it's about doing professional work, and if we're allowed to do the professional work as artists, then the communities will come. But if it's built, as a community center, the professionals won't come. So we just have to, I guess, speaking to, about innovative, cheap solutions, we don't want to be in a basement somewhere. We don't want to be, a make it work area. We want to have the best tools that we can work with. Yeah.
Just a response to Terry regarding sort of neighborhood residents. I guess, and to kind of semi-not answer it, but also try to get to it, because I think it's really critical. Part of the reason why this private property kind of discussion is so front and center in the way we're thinking about land trust is because the right to the city is very different than the right to private property. And I think the right to remain places is something granted to those who hold property and have property. And that's something that is very different than a class equity. So when we talk about equity, I think we're speaking about not just racial equity or other forms of equity, but I think class is most critical, actually, and it's something that's often not brought up. Because we're in a state of capitalism, which is very different. So just to say, I think, for example, people in very wealthy neighborhoods shouldn't necessarily have the sovereignty to disrupt and not disrupt, I was going to say disrupt the process of change, which is about a redistributive process. And they do. So that's part of, I think, a process of something like a land trust, which can be a kind of extra statecraft that comes in from the side and negotiates between government and people. It can also get in the way. So I think the critical thing is, when does a land trust not necessary? Similar to, some of our jobs, we won't need them in the future if transit is cheaper, if housing is a universal right. I won't need to do this work, which would be great. I could just be making artwork or something. Yeah.
Me too.
We're going to be moving slowly to the breakout session, which Aslam will share with us. But before we do, I just want to say thank you very much to Diane Blunt, Stephanie Allen, Moy Eng, and Brian McBay. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts.
Thank you very much to the wonderful contributions from all of the panelists. So just to remind you, what we're going to be doing now is the digestion of what was heard from the panelists, because as wonderful as it is, sometimes the contexts are different, and what we as the city want to hear is how is this relevant to us today, and how can these ideas potentially inform the next few years of arts and culture planning. So in order to go ahead with that, what we're going to do, I just want to remind us quickly of our community agreement. So that's when you have your discussions, to lead with curiosity and creativity, to cultivate generosity and accountability, to make space and take space, to take care of yourself and others, and to accept and expect non-closure. I'm going to ask for the next slide. And we're going to ask you to form groups. I know it's a little bit awkward, but this is a result of moving up from the basement to the theater, so now it's a little bit difficult to arrange the seating. But what we're going to ask is to find groups of 4 to 6 people, so just cluster around. And we're going to ask you to go to the next slide. Yeah. Okay, so we're going to ask you to answer some of these questions in your group, and we'll have our support facilitators go around with some cards for you. So the questions are, what can the city do to support greater access to space? What can community do to access secure space? And what questions do you have about space? So we've also got some people from the city's spaces team who will be floating around and listening in on your conversation and be able to answer some questions that you have. I'm going to invite the panelists to do the same, to walk around and join different groups and be involved in different conversations. And we've got about 10 to 15 minutes, so probably about 10 minutes to have this conversation. So I'll invite you to move into your groups now.
That's good. We stuck to the time too. So. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. A community center, and it's almost like there's a but we also need to distinguish that we want to do we're starting from our socioeconomic background, but this, to this, to this, to this. And I mean, I just think of multi-identity. I learned my expertise, and I'm not going to serve you as well, so I can't think there's other people versus where I'm focused. It's an easy expression, it's not. Thank you. So you're still looking for space? Is it more the programming focus right now? Yeah, when you work with bring that conversation out yet? Yeah. Okay, fine. Thank you so much.
That was wonderful.
Thank you. I know. I thought about that when I was sitting there. It's good. Thanks, Annie. Yeah, no, it's... Yeah, fabulous. Okay. Yeah. I know, absolutely. And I think my real estate skill sets are not very common in the community, and so to be able to be asking the question is actually helpful, for the work that we're doing. I know that, not every community can have that skill sets like ours, but. We don't tax our developers that much. Yeah, we really could. We could raise the taxes on those community. All right, great to see you. I was like, how big are the taxes? It's totally mayor goes to Toronto and Ottawa to talk about the transit plan, the housing secretary says, welcome to Valley Society, you guys need to get that done to the mayor. That helps us, right? And it actually has its full thing that it's some developers are doing that.
Okay, we got 2 minutes.
2 minutes?
Any favorites from these? Okay, folk, I'm going to ask you to kind of wrap up your conversations and make sure that you pass your little cards to some of the volunteers that we have around. We'll give you like 1 more minute to wrap up and hand your cards to the volunteers. Okay, thank you all very much. Okay. I want to thank you all for giving your time and energy and devotion to this really important conversation. As we heard, the question of land and the question of space, especially in Vancouver, is definitely top of mind for so many of us. And for artists, probably even more so. We've got some amazing ideas that are coming out, and I just want to read some of them back so we make sure that we're pollinating these ideas amongst all of us. Like we said, a lot of these conversations, it takes property developers, it takes art stabilization trusts, it takes people working in community as well as the city to work together to solve some of these really big challenges that we're facing. So in that spirit, to share back some of these ideas so that we can all think about what are other people thinking about, how can we make connections to make sure that these conversations are taken further. And some of these ideas, so some of them that have come forward, property endowment fund to fund public space for art, creating or supporting city staff to build competency and to build capacity for smaller organizations, using land for culture pop-up as well as permanent creative spaces. Quite a few of the cards coming forward asking like who is accessing these spaces. So it's one thing to create the space, but it's a separate question to ask, well, who has access to that space? And even these conversations that we're having today, like who are the people that have the ability, the language to access the space, to take a day from their work and come and attend and contribute to something like this? As well as like some of these very complex conversations when it comes to understanding tenancy, when it comes to understanding procurement, who has the language and ability to access these conversations, really coming up as like socioeconomic barriers to accessibility. Some of the other things is like very clear articulation of what the city's role should be, and everything from providing stability for artists to buying buildings and then renting it out to artists and to art organizations and acting in ways that I think Caste seems to be acting. Also the city relaxing certain rules and regulations, making space more accessible for artists. And I think even having worked at the city for a couple of months, learning, slowly recognizing the complexity within the city that it would take to get a lot of these things going, and how much importance is placed on like the community finding ways to come together and putting pressure in the right places so that the community and the city departments can start working together to tackle some of these issues. So with that, I think I just wanted to thank you all again for your time and to encourage these conversations as we move into the break. I hope that the relationship building, some of the new people that you met today carry on well into the future. And a big thank you to Michelle for recording the conversation graphically for us. And I invite you to come and have a look at that as well. Okay, and the last note is if you still have any cards, please make sure that you get it to us and we'll capture that in our engagement summary that we'll send out. Have a good afternoon, everyone.